The gospel and the city. Well, I grew up in the 80s. And I know for a lot of you, that seems like not that long ago. And we also have mid-schoolers in here, and so they don't know anything about the 80s. I'm still surprised and disturbed about the fact that people are now getting their driver's license who weren't around for 9/11. I think that's crazy how time seems to pass. But I grew up in the 80s. I was born in 1982, so I was a child of the 80s, loved the 80s. The 80s were a crazy time. The 80s were a time of Blockbuster VHS rentals, disposable cameras with real film in them. Do you guys remember the little switch on the side of the camera? You pop that thing, you ruin all your photos. I couldn't handle the temptation as an 8-year-old boy. Don't put them around that switch. They're gonna flip it. Without a doubt, my favorite thing growing up in the 80s, though, was me and my friends in the neighborhood. We would get on our Huffy bicycles, and we would go and just ride around the city, and we would just be out for as long as we wanted. The 80s were crazy. So we would all hop on. We would go wherever we wanted to go. We would just find whatever mischief there is to find. Come to find out, my mischief is pretty lightweight. People were curious so people came up to me after first service. Some people were telling me when they were that age, they were stealing watermelons and getting shot at with salt pellets or something. The mischief that I'm talking about, the worst thing we ever did is we would pee on the tree at the park. So it's pretty good. I know, it's pretty exciting. What a time to be alive. But we would go to the park, we would go to the elementary school, and we would play basketball there, and we would just go wherever, find our way home when we find our way home. It's fine. Now that I have a daughter, that type of freedom is absolutely terrifying. I feel like the world's changed. I don't think kids can just go out on their bikes, and we didn't have phones? I can't even conceive. Like, I like to track my wife. The idea of a kid being out there for hours at a time, untrackable, is chilling to me, but that was the 80s. I can remember me and my cousins and my sister, one time we rode to Colorado in the back of my dad's pickup truck. Yeah, he had like this camper shell, and so he just put a mattress in the back, and we would just play around, and we would crawl through the little window. But it was the 80s. It was kind of a crazy time. Well, for me, I had one of my best friends in the neighborhood. He lived across the street from me. His name was Ben Pugmire. So Ben Pugmire, he was one of my best friends growing up. We would always drive around with our bikes together. Well, he had 7 brothers and sisters. And come to find out, he was a Mormon. And I didn't know what a Mormon was. That meant less than nothing to me. All I knew is that he couldn't play and he couldn't ride his bike on Sundays. So that was enough to disqualify me from Mormonism forever. I demand a religion that allows me to ride my bike 7 days a week. Freedom in Christ. But I didn't know anything about being a Mormon. I didn't know what that meant. None of that was anything. I just knew he couldn't play, but it was fine. We were just kids. We were just playing together. We were just friends. We'll come to find out, I grow up a little bit more, and I find my way to the 6th grade, and I go to youth group. Well, I find out pretty quickly in youth group that what I should have been doing this whole time was trying to convert Ben to Christianity, right? That there was this whole idea that what I was supposed to be doing, what I should have been doing, was trying to convince him to renounce Mormonism, to adopt faith in Jesus Christ, and to pray the sinner's prayer after me, I guess. I don't know if I knew the prayer, but that was the idea. But there was this terrifying idea that finds its way into the heart of the Christian, probably around 6th grade, when we start talking about evangelism. And I think there's a lot of people in the room that if you start talking about evangelism, not loving your city, not caring for the poor, not being kind, not being forgiving, not being patient, but actually you, not the pastor, but literally you, going out into the world and proclaiming the very specific and the very particular gospel of Jesus Christ. I would say for the average Christian, that's a truly terrifying thought. And when I thought of it as a kid, I thought that was about as appetizing as shooting bamboo shoots under my fingernails, and I wonder if there's a lot of people that kind of feel that same way. But I want to start off the week and I guess, with this statement, and let me just say this. I believe that the gospel of Jesus Christ is what the world needs to heal. And I want to say that I really believe that on the record. I know this is something that as a pastor I have to say. I know that. But I want to say that I really believe that. I believe every other thing that's good, that's progress in the world, be it justice, be it peace, be it equality, if it's detached from the Christian faith, if it's detached from the very particular faith that is in the gospel of Jesus Christ, I believe it's ultimately short-lived. Because there's no roots to it. It's just relative. It's just us finding peace in things like agreement. And then when the agreement goes away, so does the peace. But there is something particular about the gospel of Jesus Christ. And last week we sort of talked about it. We found Israel in the book of Jeremiah. We found the nation of Israel in a very particular time, in a very particular place. So they found themselves in a time where they were yanked out of their native home, and they were forced to live in a new culture. They were people in exile. And so they were people who were forced to learn new songs and to even speak a new language, and they were losing what was really unique about them. And so they're feeling very displaced. They're feeling very disillusioned and frustrated and confused about the way the world's going. I don't know if anyone has ever felt like that. I feel like that all the time. More and more, I feel like as time goes on, I just find myself being really confused. I look at the news, and I think anger, I think all of those things are super true. I think for me, the predominant emotion that I experience when I read the news is just literal confusion. So I just don't know where it goes. I don't know where we go. It feels like the world is this balloon that's just continuing to inflate with more and more air. And it's just like if someone doesn't figure out how to twist the relief valve, I just think this thing's going to blow. And so I'm just confused because I don't know where we go. And so I identify, when I read the book of Jeremiah, I identify deeply with the Israelites who find themselves in an unfamiliar time and an unfamiliar place. And the prophet Jeremiah, under the influence of the Holy Spirit, would say to these people who are in exile, the prophecy was this: seek the welfare of the city in which I have placed you, for in its welfare you will find your welfare. And that's not what people in exile want to hear, right? What they want to hear is this: we're getting out of here. Any day now, we're out of here. Thank God, because this place is going bad. No, but that's the promise, that you seek the welfare of the city you have been placed in, for in its welfare you find your welfare. And we talked about how we as Christians, especially brainy ones like you guys, and myself, that we like to distract ourselves with really big issues, things like end time eschatology, what's happening with Israel, what's all this political posturing that's happening in the world, and all of that stuff. Besides prayer and besides probably voting once every couple years, you've got nothing to do with. Right? And how all of those big ideas can ultimately serve as a gigantic distraction from the very real responsibility that you have to care for the person who lives 2 doors down from you, that you actually can do something about. And so the call for the Christian in 2017, I believe, is this: care for the city in which I've placed you. I even think that evangelism is starting to shift, because I think there was a time when it was this real big speaker guy and then the regular people, and it was happening like this. I think evangelism is continuing to change, and I think it's starting to happen in small circles. I think it's starting to happen more and more in relationship, in small communities, you and your neighborhood. That's not metaphor, literal. Your literal neighborhood, the one that you live in. I think that's where the church needs to go. Is instead of just looking at the pastors, looking at Pastor Marshall, looking at Pastor Cindy, looking at Pastor David, instead of just looking to us in order to change the city, that we would all take on the responsibility that we all have to take care of our city. Amen. And that the gospel spreads not through the church building, not through even the pastors, but through the people of God who are empowered by the Holy Spirit to go out into the city. And so what I want to do as we close the series this morning is I just want to do a brief case study of three people that ultimately come to Christ, but in very different ways. So of course in the book of Acts we find Paul, the apostle. He is sent by God as a missionary to plant a church in a place called Macedonia. Macedonia is a part of Greece, and in Macedonia, the biggest city is the city called Philippi. And so this is where Paul is. He's in the big city, which is Philippi. And that's really handy for us to know because you and I, the vast majority of us, we also live in a really big city, right? Albuquerque, New Mexico. And so it's helpful and it's instructive for us to look at Paul and see how he brings the gospel into the big city for the first time. And then we can learn from him, and maybe we can even model him as we endeavor as the body of Christ to bring the gospel into the city. Okay, so we're going to do essentially three stories, three people whose lives were changed by the gospel, but in very different ways. We're going to go through a case study of Lydia, and then the slave girl, and then the jailer. And then after we go through all three, we're going to just talk about a few different lessons that we can learn about taking the gospel to the city. Okay? Okay, number one is, let's just go through them. Number one is Lydia. Acts chapter 6, verse 13 through 15, we're going to read. And it says this, Luke is the author of the book of Acts. He would say this, "On the Sabbath we went outside the city gate to the river where we expected to find a place of prayer. We sat down and began to speak to the women who had gathered there. One of those listening was a woman from the city of Thyatira named Lydia, a dealer in purple cloth. She was a worshiper of God. The Lord opened her heart to respond to Paul's message. When she and the members of her household were baptized, she invited us to her home. 'If you consider me a believer in the Lord,' she said, 'come and stay at my house.' And she persuaded us." Okay, so two things I want you to know about our first case study, Lydia. Number one is this: the Bible would describe this woman as a worshiper of God. And you might be thinking, that's a nice thing to say. I love that. That's a great compliment. It's not a compliment, it's a technical term for a Gentile who has come to believe, though raised as a polytheist, believing in many gods, though believed in many gods growing up, has come to faith in the one true Hebrew God of the Old Bible, of the Old Testament. And so believed in the scriptures. That was number one. Number two is this: it says that she is a dealer in purple cloth. We've got quite a bit of purple cloth in this church. Back in the day, purple cloth was a luxury item. So what we know from this, the fact that she was a trader in purple cloth, is this was a wealthy woman. So you've got a lady who is successful and upright and dignified and wealthy and successful, and she believes in the Bible. But she's still looking for maybe a little something more. And so Paul would sit down and he would speak to the women who were gathered there. And what did Paul say? Well, we don't know. And that's a bummer, because I would kill to know what Paul said here. But we don't know. It doesn't tell us. But we do know what Paul historically would say at a gathering like this, because we can see other times when Paul would speak to Bible-believing Gentiles. He would go to synagogues and he would kind of make some of these arguments. So what I'm going to give you this morning is I'm going to give you my very best Apostle Paul sermon mimic. And it's not going to be as good. But here's my best. So I imagine Paul sitting down and speaking to these women and saying something like this: "Look, guys, I know that you're seeking God's blessing. And I know that you're reading the Bible and you're reading about these heroes of the faith. You're reading about David, and you're reading about Esther, and you're reading about Joseph. And you're thinking, man, David, he defeated the giant Goliath with 5 smooth stones. Man, maybe if I was as brave as David, then God would bless me. You know. Or maybe you're reading the story of Esther, and Esther was the queen who risked everything in order to save her people. And you're thinking, maybe if I was as dedicated as Esther, then God would bless me. Or maybe you're reading the story of Joseph, who was betrayed by his brothers when they sinned against him, but he forgave them. And you're thinking, man, maybe if I was as forgiving as Joseph, then God would bless me. And I can imagine Paul saying, no, you're missing the point. You're misunderstanding the Bible. There is someone who is greater than all of those people, and that's Jesus. See, Jesus is the greater David. Whereas David, he killed Goliath, Jesus would come and he kills sin and death once and for all. And Jesus is also the greater Esther. See, Esther risked losing her position as queen to save her people. But Jesus lost his position, the greatest, the ultimate throne in heaven. He left his position so that he could come to earth and save his people, which is all of the world. And Jesus is the greater Joseph. Because Joseph, of course, was betrayed by his brothers, but he forgave them. But Jesus was betrayed, and he came and forgave the sin of the entire world. And so if we would just believe in Jesus, then we would be saved. And so until you put your faith in Jesus, the man whom all of these other people point, well, you're never going to be as brave as David. And you're never going to be as dedicated as Esther. And you're never going to be as forgiving as Joseph. In other words, without Jesus, the Bible is a crushing weight. It's always pointing to the fact that you're not brave enough. You're not strong enough. You're not faithful enough. You're not dedicated enough. You're not forgiving enough. And because of that, God's not going to bless you. Which is, of course, the exact opposite of the truth. See, with Jesus, all you have to do is just put your faith in Jesus, and then the God of the Bible is yours. And he would empower you to live a faith-filled life, a faithful life, just like David, just like Esther, just like Joseph. And so he would be empowered by your Spirit. And it's not about you doing, it's just about you receiving. And finally, when you put your faith in Jesus, you can live the life you've always wanted to live. And so Lydia thinks, all right, you got me. You got me. I want him. And in fact, the text, the word it uses is it means to be attracted to. So she found it beautiful. So she found this message beautiful. She says, that's the most beautiful thing I've ever heard. And then she gives her life to Christ. So story number one, you could say it like this. Lydia encounters Jesus through reason, discourse, and wrestling with the truth. And maybe you know somebody like that. Maybe you are somebody like that. I know Christians in my own life that came to Christ because of people who patiently sat with them and answered questions that they had as they wrestled with their own doubt and their own fear and their own insecurity. But this is how Lydia ultimately comes to faith, through reason and discourse. Okay, number two is the slave girl. Now, the slave girl is a little bit more dramatic of a story. Let's begin in verse 16. This is all just in that same chapter. We're just continuing where we left off. Verse 16. Once, when we were going to the place of prayer, we were met by a female slave who had a spirit by which she predicted the future. She earned a great deal of money for her owners by fortune-telling. She followed Paul and the rest of us, shouting, These men are servants of the Most High God who are telling you the way to be saved. She kept this up for many days. Finally, Paul became so annoyed that he turned around and said to the spirit, In the name of Jesus Christ, I command you to come out of her. At that moment, the spirit left her. Verse 19, when her owners realized that their hope of making money was gone, they seized Paul and Silas and dragged them into the marketplace to face the authorities. They brought them before the magistrates and said, These men are Jews and are throwing our city into an uproar by advocating customs unlawful for us Romans to accept and practice. The crowd joined in the attack against Paul and Silas, and the magistrates ordered them to be stripped and beaten with rods. Okay, so here you have a woman who has in her a demonic possession, that there was a spirit that enabled her to predict the future. In fact, the direct translation in the Bible, this phrase is the spirit of Python. The spirit of Python. Nobody in the English language translates it like that because it would just confuse us and it would make my wife squeamish because my wife hates snakes. But that's what it says. It says the spirit of Python. And you might be thinking, what does that have to do with anything? Well, it all goes back to this ancient Greek legend about the Oracle of Delphi. Basically, the idea is there's this oracle, this mystical oracle, and she lives in a temple, and the temple is guarded by a python. And so she would come, and when this oracle would come, she would put people in a trance. So I'm wondering if you're putting together a snake and the trance. Is anyone thinking the Jungle Book? Ka, remember the snake that would put people into a trance? Well, this oracle would put people into a trance, and they would begin to speak in strange voices, some high, some low, and they would, in essence, be able to prophesy about the future. They'd be able to predict the future. And so people would come from far and wide to experience this lady and her powers, and they would give lots of money. Not to her, right? She's a slave. They would give the money to the slave owners so that this woman would give a prophecy to them. And so my point is this. This is a very different type of person than Lydia, right? Lydia, put together, successful, wealthy, trader in purple cloth. Like this woman she's broken. And she's oppressed. And she's not just oppressed spiritually, although she is oppressed spiritually. She's also oppressed economically, and she's also oppressed socially. She's being exploited. And so, in order to come to Christ, you know what the slave girl did not need? She didn't need to be reasoned with, right? Not like Lydia. Like she didn't need discourse and someone to talk to her about her doubts and her fear. Like she didn't need that. That wasn't the way that she needed to come to Christ. No, she needed a radical encounter with the liberating Spirit of Christ. That's what she needed. She needed something to set her free. And maybe you know somebody like that. Maybe you are somebody like that. That when you came to Christ, it wasn't because you had something happen in your brain where you were able to deduct that the message of Jesus Christ is the truth. Maybe for you, it was an experience of being set free. Depression. Maybe Jesus came in and saved your marriage or healed your body or healed your son or your daughter. But it was through radical liberation that this woman came to the faith. And so you might be thinking, well, what does that have to do with Albuquerque, New Mexico in 2017? Like demonic possession, exorcisms? Is that really what we're talking about here? Well, instead of talking directly about exorcism and demonic possession, I'll leave that up to Pastor Marshall. Instead of doing that, I just want to say this, that from a biblical point of view, according to the authors of the Bible, everyone who doesn't know Christ is a slave. And in fact, it even tells us what we're a slave to. It says that we're a slave to sin. It says we are slaves to our worldly desires. And maybe you could just say it like this. We are a slave to our own broken worldview. I love this quote by a man by the name of David Foster Wallace. He ended up passing away a few years back. He was a writer and professor, and he has this great commencement speech at Kenyon College. And I just want to read you this quote. It's 2 slides. And he says this: in the day-to-day trenches of adult life, there is actually no such thing as atheism. There's no such thing as not worshiping. Everybody worships. The only choice we get is what to worship. And an outstanding reason for choosing a real God to worship is that pretty much anything else you worship will eat you alive. If you worship money and things, if they are where you tap into real meaning in life, then you will never feel you have enough. Worship your own body and beauty and sexual allure, and then you will always feel ugly. And when time and age start showing, you will die a million deaths before they finally plant you. Worship power, and you will feel weak and afraid, and you will need ever more power over others to keep that fear at bay. Worship your intellect, being seen as smart, and you will end up feeling stupid, a fraud, always on the verge of being found out. So, negative quote, but hear the point here. Here's what he's saying. In other words, those who seek power are ultimately controlled by power. Those who seek acceptance are ultimately controlled by acceptance. Those who seek popularity, recognition, notoriety are ultimately controlled by the people who would or would not approve of those people. Pastors who are controlled by the approval of people are controlled by people. But we as Christians, if we seek the Lord, then we're controlled by the Lord. In fact, that's the idea. We say this statement that for a lot of us, I think, can feel really benign, which is this: Jesus is Lord. Seems pretty harmless, right? It's really not. People gave their life to say that. People were killed because of this confession: Jesus is Lord. You know what that means, don't you? It means this: Jesus is King. Jesus is the one true King. So that for you, if you are someone who confesses that Jesus is Lord, then that means this: that Jesus gets all the votes. And if he thinks one thing and you think another, well, who cares what you think? Because he's the King, right? He's the Lord. And so we don't come to Christ and say, well, sounds a little idealistic. That's not practical. Doesn't matter. Doesn't matter what you think, right? If Jesus Christ is Lord, if Jesus Christ is your King, then he sits at the throne of your heart. And he gets all of the votes. And so if you live like that, where at the center of your life is Jesus Christ, well, then you're liberated. Well, then you're free. You were in bondage, but now you are a free man. And that's what happens with the slave girl. So you could say it like this: case number 2, the slave girl encounters Jesus through a radical, powerful liberation. And again, maybe that's you. Maybe that's somebody you know. But you can see how different it is from Lydia, right? That's the point. Lydia encounters through reason, discourse, wrestling with the truth. The slave girl encounters Jesus through a radical, powerful liberation. Lastly, number 3 is the jailer. Just continuing on right there in the 16th chapter of Acts. Luke says this in verse 23: after they had been severely flogged, they were thrown into prison, and the jailer was commanded to guard them carefully. When he received these orders, he put them in the inner cell and fastened their feet in the stocks. About midnight, Paul and Silas were praying and singing hymns to God, and the other prisoners were listening to them. Suddenly, there was such a violent earthquake that the foundations of the prison were shaken. At once, all the prison doors flew open, and everyone's chains came loose. I need you to pay attention to what's happening here, right? They were in prison, there's an earthquake happens, and now all of a sudden, they can escape. 27, the jailer woke up, and when he saw the prison doors open, he drew his sword and was about to kill himself because he thought the prisoners had escaped. But Paul shouted, "Don't harm yourself, we're all here." The jailer called for lights, rushed in, and fell trembling before Paul and Silas. He then brought them out and asked, "Sirs, what must I do to be saved?" They replied, "Believe in the Lord Jesus, and you will be saved, you and your household." Then they spoke the word of the Lord to him and to all the others in the house. At that hour of the night, the jailer took them and washed their wounds. Then immediately he and all his household were baptized. Okay, so the story basically goes this: Paul and Silas have been severely beaten within an inch of their lives. If you doubt that, see the phrase severely flogged. They're beaten within an inch of their lives, and then they're thrown into prison. And it's important for you to know that Paul especially is thrown in prison unjustly. Because Paul is a Roman citizen, so he has a right to a trial. But he doesn't. He just gets beat up and thrown into prison. So he's there unjustly. And there is this jail guard who has been put in charge of the inmates. And so who is he? Who is the jailer? Well, he's probably ex-military. In fact, likely he's an ex-Roman soldier. We know this because this was essentially what retirement looked like for the Roman military, is that when you would get at an age where you were no longer of use to serve in the military, well, they would give you a cushy government job, and that would essentially act as your retirement. And so you can see that this man, he's not an intellectual like Lydia. He doesn't need to be reasoned with, nor is he in profound bondage like the slave girl who needed a radical liberation. Now, this is just a blue-collar, regular guy, just an average dude, totally regular. And so how does the Christian faith find its way to him? How does the gospel find its way to him? Well, the story goes like this. They're singing songs, right? Paul and Silas in prison. And the reason is this, is that they're already liberated. They're already free. And see, because if you find your whole life in your career or your intellect or your reputation, and you get thrown into the deepest, darkest dungeon, well, then you've lost everything, right? That's it for you. But if your life is found in Christ Jesus, then even when you find yourself going through the hardest time in your life, there's still something to sing about. So they're already free, and so they're singing in the middle of the night. I don't know if you can imagine how wild that is. And there's this earthquake that happens, and the doors swing open, and the shackles fall off of their feet. And there's one thing I didn't tell you about the cushy job from the government. It's pretty great. It was a pretty great retirement. Probably had dental. This was the high life here to be a jail guard. But what you may not know is that if anybody gets out, when you're in charge, the government comes and kills you. So that's a significant downside. And so he knows this is what's going on, and so he sees that the doors have swung open, and he's assuming that everyone is left. So he draws his sword, and he's about to commit suicide. And Paul would speak up and say this: "Don't hurt yourself. We're all here. Like we're all here. We haven't left." And so here's the question: why would Paul have everyone stay, especially being a man who had the legal right to leave? The answer is this: to save the jailer, of course, right? And like the jailer, he's never seen this before. He's a military man. He's practical and he's brutal. And all he's ever experienced is might for might, eye for eye, tooth for tooth. But here we are in this story where these people, they don't even know him. And so he's thinking, why would you sacrifice your freedom for me? You don't even know me. And Paul would come and say, oh, you've never seen evil overcome with good? Well, let me tell you the ultimate example of overcoming evil with good: the man Jesus Christ. And he's just like us. He was also beaten, but he wasn't just beaten, he was beaten and killed. And he also could have escaped, right? He could have called 10,000 angels, and he could have escaped, but he stayed in his earthly cell and even gave his own life so that he could save you and me. And so he's saying this to the jailer. He's saying, so I'd gladly hang out here a little bit longer if that means you can be safe. And the jailer says, I've never seen anything like that. That's totally new. And so he ends up coming, he and his whole household come to Christ. And so you could say it like this: the jailer encounters Jesus through a practical demonstration of self-sacrificial love. And maybe you know someone like that. Maybe you are someone like that. That you don't need all that logic, and it wasn't some power encounter that brought you to Christ, but you as a practical person saw that there was something unique about Jesus Christ, and that was self-sacrificial love. It's a different thing than you see anywhere else in the world. Nowhere else are enemies defeated by shedding your own blood. But that's the Christian faith. That we overcome by giving of ourselves. That's the Christian way. That's the way of Christ, and that's the way of the Christ follower. And it's completely different than the way of the world. That's utter nonsense to the rest of the world, who always looks out for number one, themselves. But we don't do that. We gladly lay our life down. And so, and as weird as that sounds, seeing that, the world seeing that in us, is one of the things that draws people to Christ. And this is true for the jailer, is the jailer encounters Jesus through a practical demonstration of self-sacrificial love. What I'm wanting to point out here is that all of these are radically different. Number one, Lydia encounters Jesus through reason, discourse, and wrestling with the truth. You can see it's logical, right? It's happening in her brain. The slave girl encounters Jesus through a radical, powerful liberation. The chains fall off. The jailer encounters Jesus through a practical demonstration of self-sacrificial love. See, they're wildly different paths, right? Yet all heading in the same direction, that all ultimately lead to the right destination, which is faith in Jesus. And I just think that that's true for a lot of people here. If we were to ask you, how you came to Christ, if that's where you're at. If we were to ask you, how did you come to Christ? I guarantee you your story is going to be different than mine, and different than the person next to you, and different than the person next to you. And smart ministries and smart Christians know that. You know that there's different ways that people end up coming to Christ. And so you can see that Paul, one of the reasons he's so brilliant is that he's changing his strategy depending on who he's talking to, right? Right? Like he's not just going around trying to logically talk to people when that's not what they need. You know what I mean? And he's not just laying hands on people when that's not what they need. But he's able to just so effortlessly move in and out of different ways of leading people to Jesus. So 3 takeaways, and then we'll be done. Just really quick that we learn from this story. Number 1 is this. We learn that the gospel is for everybody. The gospel is for everybody. I was talking recently to a Hispanic man. He's kind of in this place where he's kind of trying to figure out the faith. He thinks he's kind of a Christian. He was a Christian for a while. Now he's still kind of trying to navigate all that stuff. But he told me that growing up, he was essentially taught that Christianity was a white Western religion. And that every culture essentially has their own religion, and evangelical Christianity was not his. And so it's been kind of a process for him, but these stories completely debunk that kind of nonsense, right? Just really briefly, Lydia, she was Asian. She was from Thyatira, Asia Minor. The slave girl, she was Greek, and the Roman jailer was, any guesses? Roman, that's right. Much better than first, you guys. You stayed through. But you can see different, right? Different nationalities, different races, different heritages, different cultures. Lydia was a businesswoman, successful, upright, wealthy. The slave girl, she was oppressed and exploited. The jailer, he was just a middle-class guy, regular dude. They were as different as could be. And so you can see that this story proves that the idea of Christianity being for one race and one social class is complete baloney. It's total garbage. Even historically, you can see that that's not the way that things play out. At one point, you'll recall, most Christians are Jews. Remember that? And then you can fast forward a little bit, and you can see that most Christians are Greek and Roman. Fast forward a little bit more, most Christians are European. Now, statistics would tell us in 2017, most Christians are Asian, African, Latin American. Why? Because the gospel's for everybody. And so we don't as people, we don't look at a certain group of people, whatever that group is for you, and say, like, those people would never come to Christ. Like, don't you dare say that. Every time you say that, you will be proven absolutely wrong. And you can even personalize it and say, don't you dare point to any particular person in your life and say, that person would never come to Christ. Then you know what you're saying? You know what you're saying? You're saying that person's not Christian material. Like, and you are? You know what I mean? Like, have you been following Christ so long that you have forgotten what a miracle it is that your butt is in that seat? Like, everyone who comes to Jesus Christ is a miracle. And any time anyone would come and confess faith in Jesus Christ, it's the work of God. That's the truth. And a miracle can happen to anybody. And so we know this simply that the gospel is for everybody. Number 2 is this: the gospel is the unifying power our city needs. In fact, we could expand that and say this: the gospel is the unifying power our world needs. I want you to imagine these 3 people with me: Lydia, the slave girl, and the jailer. Imagine that they are in Albuquerque, New Mexico, 2017. Okay, well, I can imagine Lydia. She's probably a CEO of her own company. Wealthy, has a super cool office like downtown or in Nob Hill. Drives a BMW, maybe lives in Tanawan. And then you think about the slave girl. Well, she's probably the drug-addicted 17-year-old prostitute who's walking the streets on Central in the International District getting beat up by her pimps at night. And the jailer, well, he's probably just a blue-collar APD cop that lives off Wyoming. And see, they're different as can be, and what's amazing is this, is that without the gospel of Jesus Christ, like, these people would never be friends. Like, in fact, these people would despise each other. Like, what do you think the prostitute thinks about the cop? What do you think the rich lady thinks about the prostitute? Yet what's incredible here is that these people are not just friends. Because of the gospel of Jesus Christ, they actually become family. Check this out, this quote, I've got it on the screen. Racially, socially, and psychologically, they were worlds apart, and yet all three were changed by the same gospel, and they were welcomed into the same church. And so you can actually see that this is what happens in verse 40, is that it says that all three of these people, along with the other Christians, all have gathered together to worship at Lydia's house in Tanawan. Right? Like, it's this crazy thing, and that's what's beautiful about the gospel, is that people who otherwise would not be friends somehow spiritually become family. Like, I love you guys now, right? Because you're my spiritual family, but outside of Christ, like, if there was no Christ, like, I'm just not sure you and I would be in the same circles, right? Like, I think that's probably true, and I'm sure you think the same thing about me. But that's what's incredible, is that through the body of Christ, through the gospel, we become so much more than just friends, we become family. And so, and you can see that the devil, by the way, hates that. He loves lines between groups of people. And that's why we must always be people who resist broadly, just painting broad strokes about huge groups of people, forgetting that you're talking about actual people. What is that for you? The liberals, right? The Trump supporters, the millennials, the fundamentalists, the progressives. I don't know what that is for you, but I just know this, that it's easy to abstract an issue and forget that you're talking about real people. But that's not the Christ way. The Christian way is this. We see the issue. Of course we have a position. I've got tons of positions. They change all the time. So do yours. I've got lots of convictions about all sorts of different things, but I am growing in my ability to not make blanket statements about huge groups of people, because I remember that some of those people are my brothers and sisters in Christ, because the gospel is for everybody. Growing up, especially in Bible college, I used to come down real hard on women who have had an abortion. And then as I grew in my faith, I realized I didn't know anybody who had ever had an abortion. You know what I mean? So it was just faceless sin for me. But then once I finally grew and then I started to know people, I realized that a better message is this: all are welcome here. Paul would say this: Christ came to save sinners, of which I am the worst. In fact, he prefaces that with saying this: here's something that would be great for us all to repeat. Christ came to save sinners, of which I am the worst. And the devil wants us to keep in our own individual little groups, right? Your racial group, your religious group, your economic group. He wants you to stay there. Even if, think about the slave masters here. The slave masters get really upset when the slave girl is liberated. That probably doesn't surprise you. Anybody know why? Right, yeah, it was no longer economically lucrative for them, right? Because now she can't do the prophecy thing anymore. And so they're angry, and so they start a riot. This is why ultimately Paul and Silas are thrown into jail, because of this riot that the slave masters start. And how do they start this riot? Through racial animosity. Hear that. Through racial animosity. I'll read the scripture again. These men are Jews and are throwing our city into an uproar by advocating customs unlawful for us Romans to accept and practice. Did you hear that? These Jews, us Romans. These Jews, us Romans. Us versus them. It's the record that plays over and over and over through the centuries. Is that finding a way to separate you and the rest of the people. And like, that's a city for you. That's a city. Cities pride themselves in diversity. You guys seen all of these mayoral candidates? My gosh, they were like crazy about like the racial diversity of the city. But even in a large city like ours that prides ourselves in diversity, people still, like, the different groups still don't like each other. That's just the truth. So we end up we have a lot of different kinds of cells in a city, but they're all still isolated unto themselves, right? I hope you can see yourself in that. I can see myself in that. I'm so glad that we have these types of people and these types of people and these types of people in the city. Don't get me wrong, I've never seen them. Like, I stay with my group. You know what I mean? And I think that's just what happens in the city. But the gospel comes and shatters that. The gospel unifies people across barriers of race, across barriers of class, against barriers of gender, against barriers, get this, even of religion. And you might be thinking, well, how does that work? The way that it would unite us with people who are of a different religion would be this: the gospel changes how you see people. It gives you a lens correction to where you start to see actual people, whether or not they are followers of Jesus Christ. Again, think about Lydia and the slave girl, right? So now all of a sudden Lydia, this wealthy lady, successful, business class, driving the BMW, all of a sudden finds herself sisters with the drug-addicted prostitute, right? So here's a question. Do you think that changed the way she saw other drug-addicted prostitutes? Of course it did, right? Of course it did. Whether or not they followed Christ, right? Because it gave a group of people a face. And it broke down the barriers. That's the idea of the gospel. What's so crazy is I was talking to Pastors Marshall and Cindy. Evidently they knew about this. I didn't know about it. But when we wake up as, let's say, Christian men, I'll wake up, I might check Twitter, I'll get a coffee, I'll read my Bible a little bit. Well, as a Jewish male, the wake-up tradition was a lot different. They would wake up and they would say their morning prayers. And one of the morning prayers as a Jewish male was this, and this is true. I Googled it. People are still arguing. People are still arguing about it. I should have said I verified it with the pastors. It's true, they knew about it. I didn't know about this until recently. But an old Jewish prayer for a man to pray in the morning is this: God, I thank you that I am not a woman, a slave, or a Gentile. The first time I heard that, I was like, there's no possible way. There's no way that that's a real prayer. It's real. Oh, it's real. Oh, it's super real. There's still people on the internet arguing in defense of the prayer. Sure, it's beyond me. But hear that. I thank you, O Lord, that I am not a woman, a slave, or a Gentile. Whoop, did you pick up on that? Oh my gosh. So maybe that's why Paul chose these people who are coming to faith in Jesus Christ, having prayed that prayer every morning their entire life, and now find themselves in this odd predicament of trying to share a common table with people that they had spent so much time pulling themselves away from. But that's not the gospel. So the gospel is the unifying power our city needs. Lastly, number 3, this is my last point, and I'm just about done. The gospel works through you even though you're flawed and weak and messed up. And that's good news for me. I don't know if it's good news for you. I'm grateful. I think whenever we start talking about reaching our city and going and talking to people in our city, I think I sense that people tense up. You flex your glutes because you're nervous. Because you're thinking like, I'm not going to do that. I'm sorry. I am not going to reach the city. I love you as Pastor David. I would love for you to reach the city. That would be great. I'll even tithe. I'll tithe and send you out as my representative missionary to the city. But what I certainly will not do is I'm not going to go out there. I'm not going to go out there and talk to the prostitute. I'll tell you that much. I'm not going to go out there and love on the homeless. That just ain't going to happen. And so I think when people hear the idea of like reaching your city, you don't think, and the reason is this, is you feel probably like you don't have the answers. And number two, you feel like you don't have your life all together. So maybe it'll be embarrassing because you don't have the right thing to say. Or maybe you'll be found out as a fraud. I just want you to know this, that if you're waiting to get all of the answers and you're waiting to have your life all together before you evangelize, you're never going to do it. You aren't. Days will turn into years and they will turn into decades, and you will be shocked at your lack of effectiveness in your own city. Because you were always thinking you were going to reach some magical milestone that would make it easy for you to go out and love the world. It's not going to happen. And furthermore, if God was only going to use people who were always smart, all the answers, and always put together, he wouldn't have anybody to use. That's the truth. It's not about you having all the answers, and it's not about you being put together all the time. It's simply about you having the courage to get out of the seat. I say this all the time in here. The object of church is not to get butts in the seat. The object of church is to get the butts out of the seats. Amen. And into the world. It's about you having the courage to go out into the world, to be filled with the Spirit, and to actually have faith that God could use not us, but you, literally you, the actual you that's hearing the words right now. That God could actually use you to bring the gospel in surprising and beautiful ways. My last story is about Paul and the slave girl. You guys remember that's the second story. I just want to read the text one more time. I think it's really interesting. Verse 17, she followed Paul and the rest of us, shouting, "These men are servants of the Most High God, who are telling you the way to be saved." She's a demon-possessed lady who's following them around, yelling, right? Having these demonic fits. She kept this up for many days. Finally, Paul became so annoyed. I love that. Annoyed. You hear that? He became so annoyed. It wasn't that he was like so filled with compassion that he was seeking the welfare of his city. None of that was happening. He just got annoyed that there was a demon-possessed lady who was following them around, yelling really loudly. And so finally he gets annoyed. Doesn't say anything about compassion. Doesn't say anything about kindness. Doesn't care anything about grace. And this is happening for days. Like if Paul really cared, why don't we go over there right away? He just lets this lady suffer for days and days and days until finally what? He gets annoyed. He just gets annoyed. And that's one of the reasons that I love the Bible. Because if you were trying to make up a religion, you definitely wouldn't say that. Like you wouldn't put that in there. You would just leave the saints with the halos, right? They just always do the right thing, right? But that's not what you see in the Bible. Paul was messed up. Peter was messed up. Luke was messed up. James was messed up. John was messed up. But God brought the gospel into the city, right? Still. Amen. And the city of Philippi, the first time that they're encountering the gospel of Jesus Christ, it goes and it turns the city upside down through the ministry and through the courage of Paul. And Paul was a broken man, and he was imperfect. But God used Paul in the same way that God can use you. Even though you're not perfect, even though you don't know the right thing. What you need though, is you need to care. You need to be able to see your city and see hurt people and see broken people, and that needs to affect you not just in the head but in the heart. And there's just far too many Christians that just seek to stay in the boat all the time and never go out and affect somebody. And again, it's not about being perfect, but God can use you just like he used Paul. The reason is this, ultimately it wasn't Paul bringing the gospel into the city, it was God who was bringing his gospel into the city, using Paul. So it's not Paul's mission, it's God's mission, and he uses Paul. This is not a perfect church, but God can use this church. And you're not a perfect person, but God can use you. And so the challenge as we close this little 2-week series is this. I just want to give you a challenge for this week, and it would be this: see a need in our city and fill it. See a need in our city and fill it. Maybe the need would be something like Lydia, somebody who wants to talk, someone who needs to reason and wrestle and have doubts in front of another Christian that's not just going to give cliche Christian answers, but it's actually going to hear somebody and actually going to talk to them. And maybe God would use you like he used Paul for Lydia. Or maybe it's going to be like the slave girl, and that somebody in our city needs a powerful liberation by encountering the Spirit of God. And maybe God would use you to make that happen. Right? If you're open in the same way that God used Paul for the slave girl. Or maybe it's going to be the way God used Paul when it came to the jailer, through just a very practical demonstration of self-sacrificial love. And if I'm being honest, I told this the first service, I think our city has a lot of jailers. I think that there's some Lydias. I think there is some of that. I think that there's quite a bit of slave girl, and I think that there's a lot of jailers. I think what our city needs, we need all of them, but I just want to especially emphasize that what we have to lead with as Christian people is a practical demonstration of self-sacrificial love. Do you know what that means? That means this: you laying down yourself for somebody else. It sounds preposterous, right? Not if you're a Christ follower. Not if you're a Christ follower first and an American second. Then you'd be fine with it. But laying down your life for other people. And what's so amazing about the apostles in the book of Acts is that they spoke, but they weren't particularly eloquent. They weren't brilliant preachers. They weren't brilliant communicators. But you know what? They were filled with the Spirit. They were generous with their money, and they were kind in their deeds. And that opened a door for the gospel. It gave the gospel a new hearing. And that's what I think our city needs. Because I'm pretty sure that you're like me, and that I want to go out into the city, like I'm going to go to Target, or I'll go downtown to a concert or something. I want to go there, and I want to be the mouthpiece for God, bringing the gospel into my city, and I want my words to matter. But as I've grown in the Christian faith, I've learned that it's not so much about my words needing to be better. It's about the Christian witness to the city needing to be better. And that's what's going to open the door for people to hear the words. You think about this, my last analogy. Imagine that there's I preached this incredible sermon, and you think, God, that was so brilliant and so smart. And it's the greatest preacher, and he's an incredible communicator, blah, blah, blah. And you know that when I go home, I'm verbally abusive to my wife and to my baby girl. Well, at that point, it wouldn't matter what I preached, right? You wouldn't care, right? Any truth that I would have to share is nonsense to you, right? And that's a brilliant warning to the church of 2017. Is that I think there's a lot of people in the world that don't have a problem with what we say, but they say, what you say means nothing to me. And so what we have to be as a community is people who would leave the church walls and take the gospel into the city. And it can be something that is just so breathtakingly practical that would give a new hearing to the gospel. I just bragged on my mom first service, but she had this need. She found this kind of, it was a refugee gathering of women, and she asked them what they needed, and they told her, what we need 30 women's coats. And my mom said, done, I'll do it. Not church, there was no church correlation there. She was just a human being who says, I can talk to my friends, we can get the word out, I can post it on Facebook, I can talk to people, I can gather these coats. And she's gathered these 30 coats. And I want to say that is the gospel. And when it comes time for my mom to say something to these women, you know what? She has earned her right to say something. in a way that 1,000 people on soapboxes, it's not going to do it, right? And so just open your heart to what God would have you do in this city. Maybe something small, maybe something so practical. Maybe it feels so un-Christian to like buy someone lunch, to give someone the dignity. Can I tell you something that's so dumb that I've started doing? When I talk to homeless people and they ask me a question, I go out of my way and I try to touch them. And I'm a germaphobe, so it's hard. And so, I'm not saying that you should do that. I'm just saying that's something that God's doing in me, because I'm wanting to convey the worth that God has for them. And so it's just something small. But I don't know what that would be for you. Like, what would God have you do in your family, in your neighborhood, in your community, and in your city, both as an individual, but also I think it's appropriate for us as a church to ask this question, like, what do you want us to do? Like, in what way are we supposed to bring the practical, life-giving liberation of the gospel into our city? What would you have us do? Because, man, when we put our minds and our hearts and our resources together, we can do amazing things. You see those photos? I mean, my gosh, we can do some incredible things if we have the courage to say, like, yeah, not perfect, gonna make mistakes, imperfect people, but God, you are bringing the gospel into the city. Would you use us, both as individuals and as a church?